be able to welcome two very renowned but also very dear friends and colleagues. We have Naika Foroutan and Janine Dahinden. Naika will give today's lecture, but since Janine was here, she was like the most natural, we thought, discussant to the lecture. So we will start with Naika's input and then followed up by Janine. I would like to briefly present the two, and then we start with the lecture. So Naika is Professor of Integration Research. Sorry for repetition for those who were just before in the conversation. But okay, Naika is a Professor for Integration Research and Politics of Society or Social Politics at Humboldt University to Berlin. She's also Director of the DECIM Institute, which is the German Center for Integration and Migration Research. Yeah, sorry. Naika studied political science and Islamic studies in Cologne and Göttingen, where she also got promoted, and she directed several large-scale research projects, especially on young Muslim realities and lives and identities in Europe or Germany. In 2014, she co-founded the Berlin Institute for Empirical Research into Integration and Migration at Humboldt Universität. And she has also regularly intervened into the public, political and media debate as a public intellectual. And I think the first moment where she got very renowned was her fact-checking of the Sarrazin book, the anti-immigrant and anti-Islamic book of Thilo Sarrazin in 2010. But she was also part of the founding of the Young Islam Conference, which is a forum, a platform for exchange on Islamic issues or Islam for young people and in German society. So a warm welcome to you, Naika. Thanks for being here. So, and our second special guest is Janine Dahinden from Université de Neuchâtel in Switzerland, Professor for Transnational Studies by training, and social anthropologist. Trained in Zurich and Bern. She also directs the Center for the Understanding of Social Processes called MAPS, following, I think, the French acronym for this. Yeah. So Janine, as I said, is an anthropologist and has been appointed to her current position already in 2007. She's done and guided numerous studies on different, especially transnational aspects at the intersections between gender, ethnicity, and religion. And her probably most influential concept in the last years at least has been demigranticization, or the demand for demigranticization of migration studies, which is of course challenging for us migration scholars, but we will discuss this later. A warm welcome also to you, Janine. So Naika, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much, and welcome from my side. I'm going to talk about 30 minutes about post-migrant knowledge production. As I am invited by the SFB, and this is the SFB lecture, I very much hope that we can discuss the whole notion of knowledge production and reflexivity maybe afterwards. This outline is done for about a lecture of around 30 minutes, and I'm going to talk and start with empirical pluralization of Germany. Then I want to dig a little bit deeper into the concept of pluralization, and then in the end I want to show you how our concept of post-migrant knowledge production might lead to different forms of quantitative research. So, starting with the empirical pluralization, we know that in Germany, for years, public knowledge was informed by the idea that Germany is no country of immigration. So, in 1984, former Foreign Minister Genscher said, "We are no immigration country. We can't be one because of our size and our population." Sometime later, the German Chancellor said, "Germany is certainly not a country of immigration and will never become one." And even Angela Merkel somehow reiterated that notion by saying Germany is not a classic immigration country. She acknowledged that, well, there is something going on with immigrants coming into this country, but this will not change and turn the whole narrative. Indeed, in 2010, she declared multiculturalism as dead, while bringing in a form of knowledge production where there was still the idea that there was a main corpus of native Germans, not only somehow telling how the narrative has to work, but also how this country has to be shaped and imagined. But within these past decade, Germany indeed has turned very much into a real country of immigration in terms of numbers. So if we compare Germany, for example, to the United States of America, we can see that it's ranking second in absolute numbers when it comes to the numbers of international migrants. It also is within the top 20 in terms of international migrants leaving the country, but still this number, this having in mind that Germany within the 10 past years has turned into that worldwide dynamic actor of migration, can also be seen in the numbers of refugees worldwide, because Germany is number 3 in hosting refugees in all of the world. So it's ranking in the top 5 already since 10 years, but now it's number 3, turning slightly into number 2 because Iran and Turkey are climbing up and Colombia is climbing down. This is only to make you imagine and to make you see that the numbers have turned, and we have to ask ourselves, is it the numbers that have turned the narrative, or is it the narrative that also is somehow giving us reflections on the new numbers? German population in terms of migration background is very much diverse. Nearly 30% of the population have a so-called migration background. Every third family is connected to migration. And 40% of children under 18 already have a migration biography. So there might be a change in minority-majority already in 2030, while it is mainly projected for 2035. But we can see that there has been a big dynamic also within the past 2 years due to the high number of immigrants coming from and refugees coming from Ukraine, but also in 2015 and 16 coming from Syria and other countries. So if we want to understand pluralization and its implications for knowledge productions, I started with the numbers, but as I said before, it's not always the numbers who fix a narrative or who turn a narrative or who establish a narrative. Just have in mind that in 1933, while there was this big narrative of Jewish people somehow having too much influence in Germany, their real numbers were under 1%. So the narrative can be very much stable without having any immigrants here. But indeed, I don't want to go that way. I just want to tell you within the past decade, Germany has turned into one of the biggest migration actors in terms of migration policy worldwide and politics. So starting with the post-migrant paradigm, because I want to connect it to pluralization, it's a moment and a notion to understand societies that are characterized by increasing migration-related pluralization, but also getting to Janine Dahinden's idea, it's also a concept of demigrantisize or demigrantisieren der Migrationsforschung. So assessing this post-migrant paradigm, we can do it by 3 ways. We can have in mind that post-migration might not be all about migration, but there is an after, behind, and beyond migration that has to be thought when doing empirical and analytical research. For example, we look at societies where migration has already taken place, and where we look at societies after it has been politically considered that migration is an irreversible factor. If we look at the behind of migration, we want to understand if really everything is about migration, or if migration is a kind of meta-narrative where a lot of other things are rendered invisible behind that. Like, let's say, if we're talking about the impact of migration on communalities, we have been talking the last 3 years about the factor that there are a lot of immigrants coming to the Kommunen, and the Kommunen don't know how to deal with it. But we could at least have also talked about the so-called schwarze Null, black zero, like a financial politics where all these communal practices have been confronted with situations where a lot of money had been taken out of the public realm, where schools have not been renovated, where trains have not been driving anymore from the Kommunen outside. And this was all before there was any kind of migration crisis that we could assess. And there's also a normative ontological approach to the post-migrant notion, where the idea is getting a little bit beyond this bipolar migrant-native divide while thinking in terms of Germans, Ausländers, and migrants who all somehow form the very much society we're living in, but they are not really in these bipolar structures that we always have to imagine when we talk politics. So plurality, as I'm trying to assess, is not only an empirical and numerical category, but it is also a kind of normative strategy for building new subjectivities. So quoting Hannah Arendt, she has written a lot about plurality. She said, only, and I'm quoting, only where things, without losing their identity, are seen by many in a variety of perspectives, can human plurality actually appear. Human beings actively distinguish themselves from one another rather than merely being different. So, and she said, by speaking and acting, the pluralization of society becomes visible, not only by numbers. And her quote, her idea, has mainly been one starting point also for reflecting anew on the system and concept of assimilation here, because she was saying that plurality can also be achieved and practiced as plurality when we understand that it's not only about being different, but also about forms of acting out different, speaking out different, having a different approach to society, bringing in different and novel ideas into society. While this idea of Hannah Arendt seems somehow very convincible, we did a lot of research on understanding how people act towards plurality. And so we wanted to just get this plurality notion out of the migration factor, and this is maybe what aligns me to Janine's work. We wanted to understand if people fear plurality, even if it wouldn't be about immigrants. So we asked them some generic questions like, it annoys me that the supermarkets follow every food trend, there shouldn't be more than 2 genders, or I find it exciting when the German language changes constantly and I learn new words. Especially when it comes to the language issue, you can see that there is quite a polarization. The German public is not so much open to shifts in language. We know that very much when it comes to gender studies and all the debates around that. But even though if you see, for example, the food trends and also like there shouldn't be more than 2 genders, you can just assess that there is a kind of stable part of the population that is not so prone to pluralization or maybe even resist it or dislikes it. So when we had these numbers, we correlated them with other forms of sentiments, like with anti-Muslim sentiments specifically, but also with sexism and racism. And we could obviously, you might imagine, we could see that anti-plurality sentiments in a whole correlate quite highly with anti-Muslim attitudes, and that they are indeed mediated by generalized stereotypes towards religion and Islam in particular, but also by gendered stereotypes. So there is a kind of discomfort that lies within the plurality issue, and we could assess that by the numbers that we could show you, like something around 30% would feel discomfort. So pluralization is connected to discomfort, and migration is connected to pluralization. So we asked if there is a straight way from these analogies towards migration and discomfort. So if that equals each other, if we follow the pathway of pluralization. We therefore, in this post-migrant notion, the idea was very much of, if migration might be a proxy for pluralization. So, as I said, plurality is not only an empirical description, but also a normative principle, but it challenges very much main pillars of democracy at the same time. So it challenges the promise of equality, because more and more social groups are claiming equality for themselves. It also increases demands for freedom, so therefore challenging the notion of freedom in democracy, because more and more social groups claim cultural, ethnic, religious, sexual, etc. rights. And it also threatens for some people their sense of security, because it challenges their established privileges as more and more social groups demand participation and challenge access and positions and privileges established. So the idea is, when we say there is a society that is more and more embedded in pluralization, obviously it's not only about migration. There is also a pluralization of gender, of class, of language, of lifestyles. But my assumption is that migration is on the forefront of this idea of pluralization, because people somehow have the other ideas as more abstract in their minds. If you talk about pluralization of lifestyles, it's something, if you talk about pluralization of the European Union, where a lot of countries align in one plural context, this still is something you can't touch, really. But an immigrant, a migrant body, is something that is touchable, it's tangible. You can, as Klaus Bade once said, kick it out of the country. So it's something that in the end manifests pluralization in a very concrete way and mode. Okay, coming to the next part, I wanted to just, because I was thinking about this post-migrant knowledge production, what might that be? And I found myself trying to just reduce it to the notion of maybe it is about asking questions differently. And I started already by telling you that not everything is about numbers, although we work very much with numbers in our institute, but still we know that numbers might tell different stories. So we asked ourselves whether it is the rising numbers of immigrants or rising pluralization in all its other facets that leads to diversity stress and plurality resistance, and so-called ambiguity intolerance. This is what I've been showing you before. There is a moment where people feel discomfort when it comes to plurality, and it's tied to gender, food, language, it's tied to globalization, it's tied to a lot of things, but this moment of feeling insecure very much verbalizes itself into anti-immigrant positionings. This is what I showed you with the data before. But we also ask if it is rising ambivalence, hybridization, and blurring boundaries that make grouping and belonging more and more difficult, or is it leading to higher identification and the need for identity politics that we have to follow? Coming to the grouping issue, you know, I said before the notion of post-migrant wants to get beyond the migrant-native divide. This sounds very normative, but it's also very empirical, because if we have a look at the post-migrant notion, we can see that the division of society is indeed not very much about immigrants and non-immigrants, but there are still other cleavages that play out very highly. Especially now, we can see it very much around the notion of right-wing versus left-wing. So indeed, we have a lot of immigrants who present very right-wing positions. Right now, we're doing a study where we want to know more about immigrants who vote for the AfD, and it's very interesting to see that there is a not small amount of Muslim immigrants who would say they would vote for the AfD. Why? Because they share the same principles on there should only be two sexes, there should only be two genders, countries should be more nationalistic, the European Union should not decide for Germany, or there should not be so many refugees coming into this country because they might be competition for my business and for my housing. So I think this post-migrant gives you a hint of an idea that the former processes of society, just digging into what do migrants do and what do natives do, might not give us the right answer when we want to assess changes and transformations. We also asked if rising integration leads to rising distribution conflicts, and we built up on several others who have written on that, on the integration paradox, and Aladdin Al-Mafalani, my colleague who has been here for quite a while, he has also been publishing on that issue. So we tried to raise numbers and to see if it's really that the fact that the more and more integrated immigrants get, the harsher and the crueler the integration debates become. And the last questions we were trying to assess within our quantitative research was the idea of rising democratization and if that leads to rising inequality awareness. We did that very much with our racism monitoring, where we could see that maybe the fact that we're working so much on racism within the past decade has not so much to do with the factor that racism is on the rise, but that democracy is on the rise, so that we know that within democracies, racism is something that should not be there, or that we at least should assess and should know more about it. So asking questions differently and coming to therefore coming to different data, this is not so new indeed. I brought you a quote that I very much like from Georg Simmel in 1908, where he assessed the figure of the stranger totally different than others. He said, I quote, "The stranger is not the migrant who comes today and leaves tomorrow, but the one who comes today and stays tomorrow." And obviously, while digging through that quote, you understand when you assess the question of immigrant and turning into a country of immigration, you have to pose the question in another way. So I'm going to show you with the last data, and how many time do I have? Okay, great. So I have some examples that might give you a hint about the production of knowledge actually through that lens of post-migrant society. So a couple of years ago, I think that might be even 10 years ago, we already wanted to know more about how integration is understood here in Germany. And we thought if we follow the pathway of mainstream integration ideas, the pathway would say the moment one person's entered this country, if this person fulfills several steps, we can just check the tick boxes and say, now this person has to be understood as an integrated person. So we did that with a Muslim because we already felt that this doesn't hold true for Muslims. They can be the best native speakers, physicists, they can invent, I don't know, a COVID vaccine, and still there will be a talk about whether these people with this religion fit Germany, or whether they are integrated or not, or whether their group can get integrated or not. So we did a kind of vignette design. This was a survey experiment where we created two figures, actually four figures, two male figures and two women. I just brought the men because there's also a gender factor into it. So we named them Ibrahim and Stefan, and we manipulated the design with a certain information, like Ibrahim and Stefan, they could be highly educated, or they could be Hauptschüler, they could be working in the elderly care sector, or they could be working in a mosque. So we reframed them differently and wanted to see if we feed people with different integration information, if that changes their emotional effects towards the Muslim group. And actually we could see, we did that with I think 5,000 respondents, and we could see that 30% of them would still say they would feel uncomfortable if Ibrahim or Stefan, while being Muslim, would marry into their family. While when we had them as Christians, you can see only 8% would feel uncomfortable with Stefan, but still 19% with Ibrahim, even though when in the upper issue, Ibrahim would be highly educated and working in elderly care. This wouldn't change the narrative. So you can still say, okay, well, everybody can decide who's marrying into their family, but still in terms of integration, there's not only the notion of structural and cultural integration, There's also a fourth pillar, which is called emotional and affective integration. And we could see while within this specific group, you can see that structural, cultural, and social integration can be manipulated. The emotional one still lags behind. And we also did a study a couple of years later where we wanted to test if higher integration scores with higher outgroup mobility threat, like with the high, that is what I was telling before, the higher the person was integrated, the harsher the integration discourse on Muslims turned. We did it again with Muslims. I'm very much working on Muslims in Germany. So we had this experiment also giving the treatment to different groups from East and West. And we could see that I don't have the whole number, 20% plus, some 40% would say, it's there, 39% would say, I would feel bad if more and more Muslims got into important leadership positions in the labor market. While, you know, we've been talking a lot during the Tilo Sarrazin debates that if only Muslims would ascend in societies, if only they would not only be vegetable vendors with headscarf girls, so this was his notion, sorry for that, so the idea was if they would develop, if they would assess, if they would get into higher positions in society, the notion of anti-Muslim sentiments would turn. So we did that also with, we have to be careful that educational successes of Muslims do not come at the expense of the educational opportunities of the rest of the population. And if Muslims do demands, the more demands they make, I'm afraid the better off Muslims are, the more demands they make. So people don't like Muslims to make demands in society, even though this is a lot into this narrative of participation. We also did dig deeper and published last year a study on that outgroup mobility threat where we could show that it also depends on different sections where Muslim people work. If they work in sections like, for example, higher education, or if they work in sections like law, if they work in sections working as policemen, as teachers, as professors, this is correlated highly with outgroup mobility threat. But if they work in more utilitarian sectors like working as nurses or working as doctors, this is not so much correlated with stress. It's correlated very much with stress and anti-Muslim sentiments when it's job positions that shape the cultural norms of society. Okay, I'm coming slightly to the end with another study that we did on normative antinomies, where we could see something that for those who do democracy studies might be of interest, because we could see that people tend to take away democratic rights from Muslims with the claim that those Muslims are against democracies, but still they harm democracy. So this is the kind of normative antinomy. We asked Muslims' rights to demonstrate or to go to rallies should be more restricted because they don't accept democracy. Like 40% of East Germans would agree to that, but also 30% of West Germans. I'm not reading the other parts because I think you already got the notion. So people argue, I'm against them because they are against democracy, while at the same time, the same people, if you would ask them, would be allowing for democratic principles to be erased due to their specific racism or fear or however you want to call it. So this is the last study I brought. This is quite actual from the actual racism monitor. So we wanted to see if the notion of migration background is really something in the statistics that helps us when we want to do studies on work and poverty. And here my colleague Zerrin Salikutluk, who did this study, she could show clearly that poverty risk is higher among racialized groups, like Muslim people are most at risk, followed by Asian and Black people. You can see the numbers above, the small yellow, green, and light green part where we see people who are not racialized, and then you just look down and behind and you can see that there's really indeed a very, very big difference that you cannot take away. So we then looked into fully employed persons, because normally in general the risk of poverty is lower, obviously, among full-time employees. But we could even demonstrate that while being fully employed Muslim, Asian, and Black people only compared to the non-racialized groups really score higher. So we don't know if this is absolutely due to the race and racism and racial factor, but we also controlled for other things, like we controlled for gender, we controlled for localities, we controlled for language, we controlled for a lot of things, and what remained in the end was the fact that we cannot deny this huge difference. So we cannot say, obviously, they're more poor because they don't work. They work, but they are still poor. Okay, I think now I have to come to the end. What we also did is we tried to get beyond this migrant-native divide by also doing an analogy towards East Germany. There was quite a lot of critique for that study, but there was also a lot of outreach from East German colleagues and people who said, we liked this analogy because we could show that there's two groups that are totally underrepresented. We did it with, here this is not about Muslims, this is about immigrants and East Germans compared to their positionality in society, so their representation of this group compared to the West Germans is really low in all elite positions within society. That shapes knowledge production. And that doesn't even change even when you come and show clearly by numbers that immigrants are good for Germany. So the utilitarian argument will not take away the anti-migrant sentiments. We have to try to assess that in a different form. We did a proof of being useful while collecting the numbers of immigrants during the Corona crisis, and we wanted to show how they were working within system-relevant jobs. And while 28% of the population have a migration background, like 44% of them were working in the cleaning sector, 36% in the elderly care that was specifically important during Corona, but also nearly 30%, 28% in the medical and dentist sector. So all the sectors that were relevant, very relevant, they were highly impopulated by immigrants, but that didn't change the narrative. Right after that, the AfD was on a high rise and is until now. So coming to my conclusion, I'm not going to read that all out, but I'm going to leave my slides here. If you are interested in the numbers, you can look that up. So the post-migrant perspective is what I said, providing a framework of analysis for conflicts, identities, and discourses, but also social and political transformation that occurs after migration. And the prefix post introduces a temporal dimension, but not only a temporal one. So it's only connected to what I said, to this idea of getting beyond the notion of migrants versus natives in terms of reading society. So what I was trying to show you is that the core conflict in these plural democracies is evolving around the notion of recognition and equal opportunities and participation, and these are claimed by immigrants and their descendants too. They are claimed obviously by women, by LGBTQ people, by working class people. So the idea of recognition, opportunities, and participation is deeply rooted in the promise of the German Constitution, and people are claiming that they want to have a share of that too. And this upward mobility and emancipation of marginalized groups, and together with their visibilities that where we as knowledge producers were very much part of within the past decades. So we made migration more visible, we made gender inequality more visible, racism more visible. All that visibility, all that claiming of equality also leads to demands for recognition, obviously, but is also reflected with what I could show you, outgroup mobility threat. So we can see that there is a normative paradox, and this leads to a cognitive dissonance because there is a big promise of democracy in the Constitution, while at the other side, there are highly empirical, unequal situations in this country. And I would say this might be one of the main predictors for the high rise of right-wing populism, because people do understand that this is not correct, but they have two ways to react. Either they share their resources or they reduce the norm of equality. And I think we are in the middle of the pathway of reducing the norm of equality for some groups in this country. Thank you very much for sharing your time with me. And thank you, Janine, for your comments to come.
Thank you very much.
And your work is truly important because it's important in a double perspective. It's now okay? Okay. And I think it's important because it is, first of all, the studies you're doing are very important, so the results you have, but it's also politically speaking important. And I think this is a quite nice combination, and not all scholars actually I do think have this kind of double thing. So there would have been, of course, a lot of aspects I could pick out to discuss, but I decided to focus on one particular aspect during this 10 or 15 minutes I have to talk. So it's rather one comment on Naika Foroutan's talk, basically. It's not some comments. And what I would like to do is I would like to discuss some ambivalences I have when it comes to this paradigm of post-migration. So you use or mobilize many of those what I call migration-related categories in order to do some things. Migration-related categories, by this I mean migrants, immigrants, children of migrants, migration background, descendants of migrants. And you use such categories in order to provide a framework of analysis for different things, for conflicts, identity discourses, social and political transformations, but you also use this framework to make normative claims or to show how the meta-narrative of migration has made other dominant conflicts, inequalities and boundaries invisible since years. You use it also, this kind of migration-related categories, in order to go beyond this what you call migrant-native divide. And I totally see the use of this, because I really think you can succeed to trigger debates, and even more importantly, and I think this is really important, to use these categories and this paradigm you developed, you success to create, at least partially, some alternative narratives on migration. Because I think, like also Bridget Anderson wrote a couple of years ago, we as social scientists, we are very bad in developing new and other narratives about migration that would not be migrants as a threat to national identity, migrants as a problem. And I think you somehow, at times, at least succeed to do this differently. And in the same way, and I think, as I said, the studies you use are really important because we have these numbers which gives us some tools also for, like say, political actions or at least recommendations. Yet, I think there are some downsides and pitfalls when using these migration-related categorizations the way it is done in this paradigm of the post-migrant society, and I would like to invite you to think with me a bit about this, basically. There are 2 points I would like to go a bit, I will elaborate a bit in detail. The first point is that migration as such is a political normative category that is doing certain things in terms of exclusion and inclusion, and also that this kind of categories, they reproduce the logic of the nation state, and also hegemonic power structures, inclusion and exclusion. And the question I really would like to bring up is how can we solve this conundrum? How can we deal with this kind of ambivalences? And I want to explain this a little bit more. So the first point is that many scholars showed that the category migrant is of course far from being an objective or stable category, but it is a very normative category born out of the nation-state logic and entangled also with historical connection, such as colonialism or other historical legacies and or forms of appropriation. Because you all know that no person is just migrant by default. Migrants are not born migrants, of course. And times people become migrants when they cross a national border. But not everyone crossing a border is labeled migrant. We can think of expats or tourists we wouldn't label by migrants. People might be categorized as migrants because they have a name or a skin color or other real or imagined biological cultural attributes that are discursively and politically constructed as not native, as not from here, while they never crossed any border, but they might even be citizens of the state they live. So these people will be migranticized, even if formally they belong, like they have German citizenship, for instance. But day for day, we make them understand they do not belong here. That's also, you gave examples basically of this with the integration study you showed us. And also, what we call or whom we label migrant is very different when it comes to the law, to public and political discourses, or in statistics. There are different conceptions of migrants. But I think in short we can say migrant is generally perceived as someone whose movement or presence is problematic and who is maybe rather poor. So social class is of course important, but also gender is important. So what I propose is that basically we need to de-essentialize this fundamental distinction between migrants on the one hand and non-migrant citizens on the other by kind of repoliticizing its constructions, because I see there is a risk that we as researchers, we will be reproducing this kind of power regime which produces these labels of migrants. I think you do this partially, definitely, by the way you use it. But you use a kind of the categories in order to show how it works. And my proposition would be that we would kind of need to deconstruct these categories and try to find other ways to describe the world. So my question still is, how does the concept of post-migration relate basically to these issues? I really think there is a tension there. You use this term. How do you not reproduce this kind of exclusion? How do you appropriate this category and use it in a different way with different effects than, let's say, the normative hegemonic discourses? The second point, which is related, of course, is to the fact that many researchers, again, have argued that categorizations linked to migration are deeply rooted in the construction of the modern nation state, and I definitely cannot go into detail into this. But the big picture, I just would like to show some element of the big picture, and of course the question will be, how do you address this problem with your paradigm of post-migration? So I think we all agree that since the emergence of the nation state in the late 19th century, we have a new kind of political system that introduced a truly new logic of inclusion and exclusion in terms of rights and belonging and in terms of mobilities. So one that orders the world primarily around nations and incorporates, of course, global inequality. And what is important, I think, here is that the logic of the modern nation state brings with it the idea that sedentariness is normal, and it gives the image that an isomorphism between a political authority, a nation, and a territory is kind of natural, no? This is how people who cross a national border, which we call now migrants, come to be seen as a problem. So it is from the perspective of this nationalist logic that migrants become the object of particular political and also scientific attention, because they are a kind of anomaly in this national model and pose this problem for this isomorphism between state, people, and territory. And it is in this context, I think, that these two principles emerge, which are linked to mobility. First, this distinction between the migrant other and non-migrant citizen was established through this logic of the nation state. And second, as a consequence, it became necessary for nation state to control and manage this difference through border regime, migration regime, but also integration regimes and naturalization regimes. These are all part of this logic, I think. So basically, that people move around is of course far from new, but what is more recent is the way in which nation states categorize some people as migrants and others as non-migrants, and all the consequences this entails at the border, but also once they are on the territory. And the others as a danger, as a threat to national cohesion or national identity is in this logic, of course, quite logic again. So why do I emphasize this nation-state logic? You used migration as a proxy for pluralization, and you also said, and I fully agree with you, that migration makes pluralization visible. But I think it's only in a nation-state logic that pluralization is framed in terms of migration, basically. Because, of course, there are many other categories of difference, colors of the eyes, income, age, and only some of these differences are politicized. And in my eyes, it is this nation-state logic that politicizes this difference, and which makes exactly that this other is always migrantized, and pluralization is perceived as a migrantized pluralization. So the risk maybe is that the post-migration paradigm, by using these categories, reproduces also partly the logic of the nation-state, like the national container, the exceptionalism of migration, methodological nationalism, and the question for me really is, how can you paradigm address this risk? Or to paraphrase Audre Lorde, you all know her text, probably, the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. Can you dismantle the master's house? By using the master's tool, by using these categories, basically, can we really change something? By using this logic, also these categories which are issued basically out of the nation state. So I think these are things we all encounter as researchers when it comes to this migration-related categorization. And I proposed in my work to apply the lens of what I call technologies of migrantization in order to analyze exactly such processes, and maybe also in order to be able to come up with alternative narratives. And I can definitely not go into the details, but what I understand by technologies of migrantization is those sets of performative practices and techniques that ascribe migratory status to certain people and bodies, but not to all, and hereby re-establishing this difference between non-migrant citizens and migrants. And I think that these technologies, they establish this distinction actually regardless whether the people designated as migrants are citizens of the nation state in which they reside or not, and regardless of whether they have crossed the national border or not. So I consider migrantization as a technology of power and governance, which places people in a distinct hierarchy within but also between nation states, which is always accompanied by unequal distribution of societal resources and also material resources, while affirming a national we within this system of global inequalities and nation state. And indeed, I think that nativism, a term you use now when you talk about this bipolar distinction, is clearly crucial for these technologies of migrantization. To be a nation, citizens of a nation state is often not enough to not become migrantized. Rather, one has to be considered as native, which is then constructed as a form of ancestry free of migration. But also integrationalism, I mean, this is really what you showed with your data, and by integrationalism I follow Ivo Dovecka and Wilhelm Schinkel and Manzer Egli, is basically part of this nation-state logic and part of these technologies of demigrantization. So as long as we have integrationalism, meaning that some people are subject of to be integrated and others are exempted for this idea, as long we never will get out of this discursive conundrum, I would say, basically. So, but I think what we really need is alternative narratives outside of this nation-state logic and outside of the category of migration. Or not. I mean, this is really the question I'm asking. Can we still, to go back to, can we still dismantle the house of the master even while remaining in this logic, which I think is really a different logic and really produces quite interesting things, so to speak. So the question might be, at the end, how can we construct other narratives and tackle inequalities beyond migrantization and the nation-state logic and race regimes? I didn't talk about this. The post-migration paradigm presents, I think, such alternative narrative, but does it not risk to reproduce migrantization as such? And how could we imagine, if I use my terms, a post-demigrantized society, basically? And would this help us to create alternative narratives and politics? So I basically have a lot of questions for you, and I'm very curious if you have any answers on these questions, because I think they are quite, I mean, myself, I don't really have almost no answers, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Naika, would you like to take up?
Okay. I'm happy to give you back the microphone.
Okay, wow, this is really food for thought. Is that on? Okay, just to start, I have no answers. But you invited me to think together. And I think, so there's some of your points that obviously have been crossing my mind during the past decade. And I decided in the end that I will not solve the problem, because I also might think that there might be also a disciplinary factor into it. So coming from social sciences in terms of now being very much into kind of leading an empirical studies institute with mainly quantitative research, I had to accept and understand that quantitative research needs categories. I came very much from, in the beginning, I also started with this deconstructionist move, and especially also politically, because I was very much active in a group of other scholars, but also cultural entrepreneurs and activists, and we wanted to get rid of the word migration background, because we thought this word migration background would target us all the time as the others within, so while this category was dominant within the microcensus, we thought until this category is there will always be a difference marker. But then getting more into racism research, quantitative racism research, I understood that the dilemma is on the one side wanting invisibility while asking for visibility in terms of equality. And I totally and right ahead knew that the French way of not asking for ethnic data didn't reduce racism in that country, while the British way of categorizing very difficile and very, very slightly in a lot of ways also didn't reduce racism. But at least it gave us numbers to start and do politics. So this is maybe, if I have to decide within these, I'm very happy for this deconstructivist framework to reassess the categories. But if you ask me for doing policy, I would say I need to go into a school and show that black children are treated differently only because they are black. And now you can say, and this is a very big point, what does that have to do with migration? Because there can be black kids with no migration background at all. So this turns migration studies into racism studies. And this is mainly the part where we somehow try to establish the post-migrant paradigm, where we see migration might not be the only marker. And you said it yourself, it can be gender, it can be class. It normally is not the color of your eyes, you said that. Not every difference marker is turning you into unequal treatment. But so when it comes within these two schools that are divided within sociology, those who want to deconstruct, who want to make this migration notion invisible, and those who need the categories to show inequality, I would say I slightly went from the deconstructivist part to the categorical part, where I think, yes, for dismantling the house of the master, we might need the tools, because this is the only way how we can get the windows out of their cabins, because they are made with some tools and we need those tools to get them out again, maybe. So I know that there is a kind of dilemma between these things, and when you have a dilemma, both things are right and you have to decide for one side. And therefore I think this is the main thing with the big debate of the past decade, universalist versus identity politics. So those people coming from the idea that you should be treated equal no matter where you come from, the religion you have, the gender, sex, whatsoever, they are absolutely right in their ethical and moral vision, but they are not right in their tactic. Because, this is a claim which is already, if you want to say it, in the Bible somehow, or in the Quran, or wherever, you can find ideas of equality. But if you leave it to the moral and ethical idea of there should be universalism where everyone is treated equal, you still need to get there somehow. And we discovered that within the past decades, the notion of making yourself visible as part of a group gave you political power, or gave others, or gave this moment of this visibility, paved the way for making the claim for more participation, and more somehow getting into positions and getting into politics and getting into hierarchies, just because making others feel uncomfortable. And this obviously isn't nice, and this doesn't feel good for the others who have to reflect on their privilege and stuff like that. All these verbals and terminologies, we know them and we are bored by that terminology ourselves, but it was a good tactic to somehow get into these positions. And now time has changed. So we as social scientists, anthropologists, we also have to acknowledge that we do knowledge production during certain times. And I remember the times 10 years ago, 15 years ago, where we had a quite good life and could say, well, it's racist if you tell me that you speak good German. Something like that. Or please don't ask me where you come from. I mean, I have a very good friend, she wrote a whole book on that. And now I'm sitting there and I just want to say, this is not a problem, There is big and high problems of people getting killed at the borders. Migrant and immigrants is a very powerful notion. together with the notion of refugee. You know, we have a new notion here that we have to talk about. And our problems from 10 years ago now turn into luxury problems. In times where times are good, we can talk about that I feel offended if people tell me I speak good German. But now, this is not the time for that. The time now is that there is like a party on the rise, right-wing populism, right-wing extremism. Problems are becoming more real. Like in a Leninistic concept, they're really becoming more real. And so deconstruction is not about real problems. It's about a time where we had more time to think. Now we have to do more reaction. And this is what I think when, we are also talking about a decade where migration has become so omnipresent in real numbers, also in real numbers. Like compared to 10 years ago, far less people were on the move. Far less people were refugees. Far less wars were reframing our societies. And I think we don't have to forget that. You're asking for how can we introduce that? How can we merge that maybe? And I think this is like a pathway, like the universalist issue. One day, I have a dream, we'll get to that. But the way we get to that has to be planned tactically. I do think so. And I think during that time, we need to make those who use that language understand that we can fight them back with their own languages. Because we did not do so well inventing our own terminology. They got bored of us. They got reluctant. We invented very tools of our own with a lot of specific dialectical, very, very difficult notions of talking, and we only understood ourselves. And therefore, I think we have to maybe get back to that moment and understand what time frame we're acting in right now and how, like Thomas was saying, that how dangerous our times are, how far more dangerous than 10 years ago in terms of anti-democratic and in terms of authoritarian turn we're into it. And maybe I just think I don't want to say we postpone it, but I am thinking about a new word, so maybe we can work on that together. And because I thought all these posts, the time of the posts is somehow over. And but I mean, I'm offering a new thing, which is also a construction, but I did some classes teaching on that, and the students taught me a lot of interesting new stuff. And I'm trying to work with the notion of pan again, like pan-progressivism, how to align progressive issues from climate to technology, to money transfer, to bodies, to performance, and to class and race and gender and language, and how we can align these progressivity on different notions, also on global notions. And I'm mainly doing it actually with a specific view on Middle East. So I'm writing on Middle Eastern futurism and how pan-progressivity from Iran to Pakistan and Afghanistan can align into a new flow, digging from history and receiving from Palestine, and how this all can somehow align first in the idea of a new utopia, but not being empirical at the moment, because empirically what's going on there is a terrible war and not really the idea of progression at the moment, but we can grasp it if we dig into it. And so maybe this pan-progressive idea can align to post-migrant and to demigrantization. And this would be the offer, because in the end you asked me for new terminology, so maybe that could be one. We have to think and write on that further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.